Mixing with Mike, bootcamp tip, simplify and feature. What you'll notice about every great mix and even every very good mix is the simplicity of it. Often when you, and this is an effect that you hear over and over again, you listen to a great mix and you think, wow, there's like three instruments or four instruments, or you hear five different things. And sometimes you get more than that or whatever, but there's a simplification to it where even if you can pick out individual instruments, it never feels like too many things are grabbing your attention. And there's an important lesson to be learned in mixing this way because one of the things about the psychology of the human mind is that we really only focus well on one thing, a primary focus at a time, and we can have a secondary focus, and and that will be something that will grab our attention, but doesn't necessarily take our primary attention. And in fact, the more you zoom in on focus on one particular thing, the more that you exclude the other things around it. So there's a balance in a mix where obviously you want the whole of the mix and all of the music and the integration of the whole production to sort of come to fruition so it comes across as one thing. But you don't want to give the listener too many things that are attracting their attention, otherwise, it distracts away from the song. You'll notice this with so many mixes and doing so many mix analysis, and I do these really in depth in the boot camp, where we go through these productions and you notice the way that so many people mix records. One of the most common things that people do is they'll take and they'll mix like all the bass and the drums or a lot of the rhythm section instruments right down mono, right in the middle of the mix. And they'll just have this whole thing sort of driving like an engine. And what that does is it allows this sort of free open space for effects and for things that allow a vocal, for example, to become more interesting. Now you can put this super wide effect on it and it becomes really powerful and exciting because of the contrast to where everything else is mono. Yet, because you have that extra width effect, you can mix the vocal right in with that other instrumentation so that rhythm tracks around sounds super powerful and you get this wide width effect that really allows you to pay attention to the vocal and hear it clearly without losing the power of the track. So you get the best of both worlds. Now, I'm not saying you approach every mix that way. That's just one example of a mixing strategy that happens to work. It's a formula that works in a lot of mixes. Another one is to kind of spread everything wide and leave the center a bit more open, where it has just some of the basics and the vocal in the center, and then all of the other elements are hard left. So all the stuff in between the center and the left and right speaker gives you space to put effects. One approach, though, that you can take that's a very powerful way, and there's a couple of tips here that I'm going to give you about combining instrumentation. So one thing is pan location, sometimes simplifying your pan location. So in this reggae track, one of the things that I did here was I made the drums and the bass all mono. I mixed it so that it all kind of glues together mono. I have a parallel compression here that really, kind of hones it in and kind of keeps it focused. And then I did one other element here, or one other thing here in particular that glues together the drum tracks, and that was to have one primary compression component. And if you look here at the basic settings, you'll notice that the only thing that changes from one to the next is the threshold, right? The attack and the release settings are fundamentally the same. And you can see here, right, that everything basically lays out just exactly the same. The purpose of that is to get the whole drum kit to sort of breathe or pump or move and have the same kind of tonal coloration of whatever that component will give, so that it actually gives it a unique character that allows the listener to sort of identify it as a singular thing rather than a lot of things. And this ends up being a very big thing when you have loads of percussion, or even with acoustic drums. One of the biggest failings that people have is that when you listen to the drum kit, it sounds like six things are coming at you instead of sounding like one thing that sounds very focused. And that doesn't mean you have to make it mono, but if you process with similar processing chains, so if you apply like a similar set of tools for equalization, compression, and the focus, like you see here, we have a Helios console that's running on. We have a Pi compressor to give it kind of a vintage component. We have the API that sort of gives it like all of the pumping, breathing movement that we want and placement. And that's enough to sort of glue those elements together to make it sound like one thing. On the other side of things, I have here in this mix a series of guitar tracks. There were actually 5 guitar tracks, but the 5 guitar tracks on their own, let me scroll up to them, end up being kind of too much information. So what I did was I took the 2 guitar tracks that are here and I combined them together. I actually did a bunch of editing work so that I could get the ones that would blend them together. So this one guitar track that's on the left, instead of sounding like 2 guitar tracks, sounds like one guitar track that's all kind of tight and blended together. Same thing here. This is a very common thing with keyboards as well. So you mix keyboard tracks, you have 4 keyboard tracks that are playing exactly the same sound. Like here, we have these parts here where what I have is 2 keyboards. I blend them together so it sounds like one instrument. When I get to a place where one of them plays on its own, all I do is just lift the automation out from the other. Raise the volume of that so I hear that one characteristic. Then when they go back together, blend them back in together again. This is very true with like synths and things like that, where each one has a different texture. Blend them together rather than trying to make them all sound separate. Get them so they sound like one thing. If any one of those elements does something different or interesting, you lift it out, you pull down the others, you get that little line, that little riff or whatever it is, and then you pull it right back down into the mix. The idea being that you want it in every stage, in every possible way, cumulatively across the whole of the mix, to actually combine elements as much as you can to sort of simplify the production and then bring out or expose those different elements where they're sort of necessary or where it is necessary to separate them. Really true for a lot of electronic and program music where things are layered and layered and layered, as opposed to something that's like a band production where everybody has their parts and they just all complement each other. And as long as you're not layering on 85 additional parts, the doubles and triples and quadruples and layers of sounds, then all of those parts kind of have their own thing. You give them their own space. But as soon as you start layering, simplify first, feature where it sort of works in the production for the instant that it does, pull it back in and blend it. It's such a powerful way to create openness and space and simplicity. So the listener, when they're focusing on the mix, when they're listening to the mix, can take in the song, right? And I'll do a separate tip just on how to create the focus, the primary focus in a mix, which will be a whole separate lesson. But with this, when you do that, what you do is you create the opportunity or the platform from which the song can actually come across through the vocalist. You pay attention to the lyric, everything that they're saying, and then when it's appropriate, build the energy by expanding and separating out those parts as necessary. It's such a powerful way to make your mixes so much more effective. If you really listen and you just pay attention to that one component, just listening to commercially released mixes, you'll hear this style of mixing over and over and over again. And you'll think, oh, there's 12 tracks in this. And then when you see an interview with the producer or the engineer, they'll say there was 120 tracks. And you're like, where did that come from? That's exactly what I'm talking about. So there's your Mixing with Mike bootcamp tip. Simplify and feature.